Interventions 2007 by Noam Chomsky is a collection of short essays published in various newspapers between 2002 and 2007. The book covers a broad range of topics, but its central focus is on American foreign policy, global politics, and the intersection of military power, corporate interests, and human rights. In Interventions, Chomsky provides sharp critiques of the American government's actions in the post-9/11 world, particularly focusing on its military interventions, the war on terror, and the implications of American hegemony for international relations and democracy. Throughout Interventions, Chomsky argues that American foreign policy, particularly its military interventions, has been a major source of global instability and suffering. He criticizes the American government for engaging in aggressive actions that are disguised as efforts to spread democracy and fight terrorism. However, according to Chomsky, these interventions are primarily aimed at maintaining U.S. geopolitical dominance and controlling access to resources, particularly oil. Chomsky points to the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 as a prime example of how American foreign policy fuels instability. The invasion, he argues, was illegal under international law and was based on false pretenses, such as the claim that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. Instead of promoting democracy and security, Chomsky asserts that the war in Iraq led to chaos, increased violence, and widespread anti-American sentiment in the region. He emphasizes that the true motivation behind the war was America's desire to control Iraq's oil reserves and assert its influence in the Middle East. Chomsky also critiques American interventions in Afghanistan, arguing that the invasion and subsequent occupation have done little to improve the situation for ordinary Afghans. Instead, America has supported corrupt leaders and exacerbated conflict, all while pursuing its own strategic interests in the region. Chomsky emphasizes that American interventions often have disastrous consequences for the countries involved, leading to the destabilization of entire regions and the loss of countless lives. A central theme in Interventions is Chomsky's critique of the war on terror. He argues that the American government has used the threat of terrorism as a pretext for expanding its military power and justifying its interventions around the world. According to Chomsky, the war on terror is not primarily about defeating terrorism, but about maintaining American dominance, particularly in regions of strategic importance. Chomsky highlights the hypocrisy of American rhetoric, noting that while America claims to be fighting for freedom and democracy, it often supports authoritarian regimes and engages in actions that violate human rights. He points out that America has a long history of backing dictatorships, such as those in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, as long as these regimes align with America's interests. This selective approach to democracy, Chomsky argues, undermines the credibility of American claims to be promoting human rights and justice. Moreover, Chomsky critiques the American government's response to terrorism, arguing that it has been counterproductive. He notes that America's reliance on military force, including drone strikes and torture, has often exacerbated the problem of terrorism rather than addressing its root causes. By failing to tackle issues like poverty, political repression, and America's support for oppressive regimes. Chomsky believes the war on terror has only deepened resentment toward America and created conditions in which terrorism can thrive. Chomsky frequently highlights the double standards that characterize American foreign policy. He argues that America applies one set of rules to itself and its allies, while holding other nations to a different, stricter standard. This inconsistency, Chomsky contends, is a key feature of American imperialism, allowing America to justify its actions, even when they violate international norms or human rights. One example of this double standard is American government's stance on nuclear weapons. While America demands that countries like Iran and North Korea abandon their nuclear programs, it continues to maintain its own vast nuclear arsenal and supports allies like Israel, which also possess nuclear weapons. Chomsky argues that this hypocrisy undermines international efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and fuels global insecurity. Chomsky also critiques the U.S.'s approach to international law. He points out that while the U.S. often invokes international law to justify its actions, it routinely ignores or violates these same laws when they conflict with its own interests. For instance, America has refused to ratify important international treaties, such as the International Criminal Court Treaty, and has engaged in actions, like the Iraq War, that clearly violate the United Nations Charter. A recurring theme in Chomsky's work, including in Interventions, is his critique of the mainstream media. He argues that the media plays a central role in shaping public perception of American foreign policy by framing American actions in a positive light and marginalizing dissenting voices. Chomsky contends that the media acts as a tool of the political and corporate elite, helping to manufacture consent for American imperial policies. Chomsky critiques the media's coverage of the Iraq War, noting that many outlets uncritically repeated the government's claims about weapons of mass destruction and the need for military intervention. By failing to provide independent analysis or question the government's narrative, the media helped to create public support for the war. Chomsky argues that this pattern of media complicity extends to other aspects of American foreign policy, including the war on terror and American interventions in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Chomsky also discusses the importance of alternative media and independent journalism in providing a counter-narrative to the dominant discourse. He argues that without access to critical perspectives, the public remains uninformed about the true nature of American foreign policy and its impact on global politics. Chomsky emphasizes the role of corporate power in shaping American foreign policy and perpetuating global inequality. He argues that American interventions are often driven by the interests of multinational corporations, which seek access to resources and markets around the world. Chomsky points to the influence of the oil industry in the Iraq War, as well as the role of other corporations in shaping trade agreements and economic policies that benefit the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Chomsky critiques the neoliberal economic policies promoted by American and institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. He argues that these policies, which prioritize privatization, deregulation, and austerity, have devastating effects on developing countries. Instead of promoting sustainable development, Chomsky contends that neoliberalism exacerbates poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation, while enriching a small global elite. He also discusses the role of international trade agreements, such as NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, in perpetuating inequality. According to Chomsky, these agreements are designed to protect corporate profits and ensure that wealthy nations, particularly America, maintains control over global markets. The consequences for workers, both in America and abroad, are often severe, as these agreements lead to job losses, wage stagnation, and the erosion of labor rights. Chomsky is deeply concerned about the erosion of democracy in America, which he attributes to the growing influence of corporate and elite interests. He argues that American political system is increasingly controlled by a small group of wealthy individuals and corporations who use their money and power to shape policy in their favor. As a result, Chomsky contends the interests of ordinary citizens are often ignored. Chomsky points to the role of money in politics, particularly in the form of campaign contributions and lobbying, as a key factor in the decline of democracy. He argues that politicians are more accountable to their wealthy donors than to their constituents, leading to policies that benefit the rich while harming the poor and middle class. This concentration of power, Chomsky warns, threatens the very foundations of democracy, as it limits the ability of ordinary people to influence political decisions. He also critiques the increasing militarization of American society, which he sees as another symptom of the erosion of democracy. Chomsky argues that American government's focus on military power, both abroad and at home, has led to the suppression of civil liberties and the expansion of executive authority. He warns that this trend towards authoritarianism, coupled with the growing influence of corporate interests, poses a serious threat to the future of democracy in America. Despite his grim assessment of American foreign policy and the state of democracy, Chomsky expresses hope for global resistance and social change. He highlights the importance of grassroots movements, both in America and around the world, in challenging corporate power and imperialism. Chomsky points to the anti-globalization movement, environmental activism, and protests against the Iraq War as examples of how ordinary people can resist unjust policies and work towards a more just and equitable world. Chomsky argues that activism and solidarity are essential for confronting the challenges of corporate power, imperialism, and global inequality. He emphasizes the need for a global movement that unites people across borders in the struggle for justice, democracy, and human rights. While the forces of power and domination are formidable, Chomsky believes that collective action and grassroots organizing have the potential to create meaningful change.